Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, COVID-19 Pandemic and Clinical Data Management, Webinar Series 2, Initial Response from Industry to COVID-19. The webinar will start in a moment. However, I would like to share some housekeeping information. The presenters will first go through the presentation, and then there will be a 30 minutes questions and answer section at the end. However, should you have any questions throughout the webinar, you can do so in the questions panel, which will be addressed in the question and answer section at the end. My name is Shaya and I'm the SCDM Education Coordinator. I am pleased to introduce to you today Patrick Nadolny, who is the Global Head in Clinical Data Management and Programming of Allergen, followed by Dimitris Zambas, who is the Global Head in Data Monitoring and Management at Pfizer, and last but not least, Peter Stockman from Bayer, who is a Senior Expert in Clinical Data Management. And now, without taking up too much of your time, I would like to introduce you the first speaker, Dimitris. Would you like to begin?
It's me, Patrick.
Oh, sorry, Patrick, would you like to begin?
Of course I do. My pleasure. So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Welcome to the second webinar from SCDM on COVID-19. It's my pleasure to welcome you and kick off the webinar on initial response from the industry on COVID-19. So with me, as mentioned, will be Dimitris and Peter. So in this webinar, we will share concrete examples of measures taken by organizations in response to COVID-19. And we will put that in line with regulatory agencies' feedback on COVID-19 and guidance that we presented about 2 weeks ago. But before we dive into the webinar, let's look at the overall framework put in place by SCDM. So Triffin, next one, please. We move to the next slide. So about 2 weeks ago, we had a webinar, the one before Triffin, sorry. 2 weeks ago, we had one webinar on slide 3. My apologies. So yes, 2 weeks ago, we got a webinar on COVID-19 regulatory guidelines. So that one was not meant to dive into what companies have been doing, but just to summarize what regulators have been providing as guidances. We covered guidance from the US, EMA, UK, Germany, India, Japan, and China. So we already covered global regulations. I know there were much more, but we believe we covered the vast majority of them. So we had about 600 participants last time. So today, what we want to do is share concrete examples of what companies have been doing in response to COVID-19. Last, we are in the process of scheduling a webinar on a panel discussion of what leaders have been doing or suggesting to their organization. So maybe next one. So, and we believe that collectively all those webinars will give you a good flavor of what to do in the context of COVID-19. So I'll spend a little bit of time on that one slide, and I'll go slowly on that one. This is the last slide from our previous webinar. As you can see, it covered feedback from 7 agencies. You can see EMA being mentioned twice, because we had 2 guidance. One was called the PTC, the point to consider, on the guidance to sponsor. And as you can see, there is some consistency across agencies. So we have numbered them basically 1, 2, 3. So what I would mention is all guidances, category 1, safety of clinical participants and interactions with authorities, have been mentioned 8 times out of 8 guidance. There is 100% consistency across the agencies. It is not surprising to see patient safety at the top of the list. It might be a little bit more surprising to see interactions with authorities. So first of all, a lot of the authorities reacted pretty quickly in putting guidance out there, but they realize that they may not be able to provide all the answers possible at the speed of the evolution of the pandemic. So they have been coming back and updated their guidance on between the last webinar, a couple of weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, and today. Some of them have already been updated. One thing to mention is authorities, so agencies, are more flexible and open than people think, actually. They are very open to feedback and are very open to help us out. So they are really engaging us to reach out to them to have meaningful discussions. And as one example I can mention is even though they really have to enforce regulations and they have to do inspections, they could find innovative ways to do so in the context of this pandemic. So in my organization, one of these 7 agencies did organize the first remote sponsor inspection. So that agency did a sponsor inspection of my organization on the phone via WebEx. We were able to exchange documents, information, and that inspection went very well. It ended up being successful and we got approval, and the agency was very supportive and we did not get delay in getting our drug approved. So it's one example of flexibility, and they realize the complexity of managing clinical studies in the context of COVID-19. So when you come to category 2, protocol deviation was mentioned in 7 out of 8 of the guidances. So not surprising, and we'll cover it in much more detail during this presentation. We expect a lot more protocol deviations during COVID-19. For example, we anticipate a lot more missed visits, missed procedures as a result of site or patient being quarantined. So no surprise there. One point though on protocol deviations, and we mentioned it a couple of times throughout these presentations, and it's especially noted by EMA, no prospective protocol waiver is authorized. Don't do that. It's not acceptable to have prospective waiver. And EMA made it clear, just don't do it. When it comes to category 3, so I would say patient continuation and discontinuation, safety assessment, study monitoring was mentioned by 6 out of 8 guidances. Big focus on last but not least for 5 out of 8 guidance, IP, sending investigational product to patient home, protocol amendments, and COVID-19 risk assessment. So you can see a lot of consistency, and the themes are pretty clear. And we will be covering a lot of those during this presentation today. So 3 things, next slide. Sorry for the slowness, guys. So this slide is summarizing what we're going to cover today. So our intent is to share reactions from organizations as a result of COVID-19. Sorry, one back, 3 things. And in line with the regulatory guidelines. So we reached out to 14 organizations, US and EMA based primarily. So most of them were sponsors. One was a CRO, one was a technology provider. We had feedback from small and large companies, and we covered those 8 areas. And if you think about it, they tie very closely with the summary on regulation I just shared on the slide prior. 1, trial conduct. This touched on many of the key areas from the regulator, including protocol amendment, subject management, which was a category 1 with safety, and a category 2 with patient discontinuation, site management, which include site monitoring, covered by 6 out of the 8 agencies, data management, while it's not covered specifically during in those regulations, data management is highly impacted by those regulations on COVID-19 and is, of course, the main focus of SCDM. So we cover clinical supplies, which include IP, again mentioned by 5 out of 8 agencies, protocol deviations, mentioned by 7 of the 8 guidance, patient safety, number 1 concern, and last but not least, clinical study reports, while only mentioned by few of the guidances. A lot of the information protocol deviations, change to procedure will have to be documented in your CSR at the end of the study and need to be specifically addressed by organizations. So we'll touch on that topic. So next slide, Christine. So we'll dive into the first topic, so trial conduct here. But before I jump into that first slide, let me make a few general comments. So at the top of the slide, you will always see the topic we're talking about, so trial conduct. The first statement under the slide title, in bold, feedback from most companies on. So it kind of implies that everything shared on that slide was adopted by most of the responders to the survey we did. So I would say at least 75% of the responders to that topic applied a similar strategy. You'll see down, and a couple of slides later, we'll say other feedback for some companies. It was maybe done by 1, 2 companies, but we felt that feedback was still very interesting and was useful sharing with all of you guys. So now let me dive into the first category, trial conduct. So on first one is protocol amendment. So most companies are not requiring systematic protocol amendments due to COVID-19. So you stand at slide 13, slide 6. So on protocol amendments, we are done case by case. So first of all, when protocol amendments were done, slide 6, Stephen. It was mainly due to to allow for home visits, to extend visit windows, update time and events. Some companies have amended inclusion-exclusion criteria, either to loosen inclusion-exclusion criteria to reach out to more patients, and some of them have included exclusion criteria for patients infected by COVID-19. What is critical to mention for data management, the primary audience here, is that protocol amendments were not made for capturing additional information due to COVID-19. And you'll see throughout the presentation today, very, very few organizations have updated their ECRF to collect more information. We know that the pandemic is not going to last forever, even though it's critical. We did not want to, many companies did not want to change the ECRF and have permanent changes that could complicate the study moving forward. Two statements is EMA. Any change to your process needs to be proportionate to the risk, and we need to take into consideration interest of the patient on the site, as well as the safety and well-being of the patients. And again, prospective protocol waiver remain unacceptable. So next slide, Christine. So on the next slide, slide 7. I know there is some slowness, I apologize. Yeah, so it is clear that it's mentioned in the guidance, most companies are implementing a risk assessment and an impact assessment on clinical trial. So first, I'll cover risk assessment. I want to mention first that SCDM has in the SCDM portal those risk assessment and impact assessment documented. So we provided initial feedback on what could be considered as a complete risk assessment and impact assessment for clinical data management a couple of weeks ago. On those impact and risk assessment are both available in the community web portal, and you have the link at the bottom of this presentation. When it comes to risk assessment, I'm not going to dive too deep in those just yet, because we're going to cover a lot of them in the presentation later. But first of all, when you do a risk assessment, you need to consider patients and study participants. So when they're unable to travel to sites, resulting in missed visits, missed procedures, unable to use a central lab, so patient is not going to the site and you cannot draw a blood sample. You could have compliance issues with site-based ECOA or COA. When you use a telehealth visit, how do you record information in your ECRF and in your source? Or do you need to consider impact on IP, on impact on enrollment, on an increase of discontinuation in your study. So there's a couple of things that could happen, and we'll touch on those in the next couple of slides. So next slide, Trishin. So next slide. So I'll look at my notes. So on the next slide, on slide 8, when it shows, so it's about sites unable to commute to work. So sites not being available will potentially have an impact on entry of data in your EDC system, delay in query resolutions, delay in site initiation and enrollment, delay in processing lab sample, and enable to cheat IP. It could be impact on IP, receive IP from depots, and which could lead potentially to bulk dispensation options. So all of that are risks you need to consider and address during COVID-19 and the pandemic. So next slide, please. So next slide is about monitoring on vendor, and you'll see on the next slide that again, when it comes to site monitoring, it's really about site so monitor not being able to do source data verification, which could have an impact on your database log, assuming you do require a SDV to be totally complete prior to database log, and it could generate delays in data reviews or court reviews by your monitor or your study team. When it comes to vendor, again, but you have to consider labs, ECOA, IXRS. There is a broad impact in general. So you could have delays in sample analysis, delays in data transfer and reconciliations, and delays in shipment of ECOA device. And you may need to consider paper on web backups. So next slide, please. So next, I'll cover quickly the impact assessment. That is likely not going to be covered in great detail during this presentation, and will be covered on the next panel discussion to come, the third webinar. So when it comes to impact, so you need to consider the potential impact of COVID-19 on your clinical study. One, you need to summarize the impact of missing data. So you might want to focus on critical endpoints, and you need to work closely with your statisticians, considering the critical data as defined in your protocol and statistical analysis plan. You need to also make sure you define clearly what is data totally missing and data you're not getting right away, you may get later in by other means. You need to consider if the patient has been missing X number of visits, you might consider that patient being discontinued. Does it make sense to continue patients after they have missed their 3 visits? Does it make sense to continue that patient? And need to consider practical options for capturing missing visit and procedures in your ECRs, and we'll cover that later. And next slide, Griffin. So assessment of procedures that cannot be done centrally. So for non-specialty lab, you may consider local labs instead of central lab. You could use a local branch of a central lab. That's one option. You may need to qualify a local lab or other branch. So you need to look at the impact of qualifying vendors, supporting lab. You might have, so it might impact medical imaging as well, and you might send patients to have MRI or other imaging related activities in local facilities, but you need to assess the impact on your primary efficacy. And you need to consider design to your EDC system to be more flexible, to account for local labs versus central labs. For the central lab, you may get it through a data transfer. What do you do with local lab values? Next slide, Griffin. So on the impact assessment, again, you need to have impact on protocol deviations, and need to consider if you have enough AD checks or reports to detect new protocol deviations related to COVID-19. And you might need to be able to filter COVID-19 specific protocol deviations. Last but not least, you need to consider risk-based approaches and practices in the context of COVID-19. You may suggest to have specific key risk indicators and so on. So next we'll go to the first poll questions. Christian, next slide. And if you can pull the poll, so the first poll question. So the question is the following: as a result of COVID-19, did your company halt enrollment, delay new studies, leverage telehealth visits, allow IP shipment to patients' home, or none of the above? And you can pick all that apply. You can select multiple answers. We'll give you 1 minute to answer, and we'll show the responses. And I know many of, and you'll see in the feedback later, these are strategies that some of the companies have been implementing in the context of COVID-19 with some variations on the on how many of them you're using. Some are only stopping enrollment, some are delaying new studies, some are, but everybody is using telehealth. So it's not totally consistent across companies, but it's very interesting actually. So we'll give you another 20 seconds and we'll pull the answers. Can we show the answers now, Griffin? So I'm taking notes to 82%.
Let me know if you can see it.
Yeah. We can see, yes.
Okay, perfect.
43. Okay. Now, you know what? I think the responses are pretty good and in some extent pretty consistent with what we're going to share later. Many companies, not all, have halted enrollment, either globally or in specific impacted countries. Many organizations, but not all, have delayed new studies, and some have delayed new studies only in specific areas. So telehealth is growing, and actually it's an interesting feedback from COVID-19. If you would have asked companies prior to COVID-19 on how many of them have been using telehealth visits. Very few would have said yes, but now you're seeing an increasing number of companies using telehealth visits. Same for shipment to patients, even though not every drug could be shipped to the patient. So you cannot, drug has to be self-administrable to the patient. So not every drug is compatible with home delivery. And right, very few companies have not considered any of those for just yet, but I think it's just the beginning. So Stephen, can you go to the next slide? No, thanks for the feedback. It is very consistent. So slide 14, Stephen. So again, it's consistent with the poll we just did about telehealth and home delivery of IP. So most companies are considering implementing some or many of the processes and technologies used in the context of decentralized clinical trials. What I want to mention is SCDM just launched a new clinical data science website. And in the website, we're going to publish what we call topic briefs. The first one we published was on decentralized clinical trials. Not everybody knows yet what is a decentralized clinical trial. So it's very interesting actually. And if you want to know more about it, you can go into the SCDM clinical data science portal. Next slide, Tristan. Yeah. So while I will not spend too much time on that slide, but I want to make one clear statement here. Few people may be confused on what a decentralized clinical trial is. It is not a different study design. It is not like umbrella, adaptive, basket. It's not something you're changing in your protocol per se. It's really about on how you're essentially decoupling your clinical research from a physical site. Is really having telehealth visits, sending drug to patients' home, having nurses going to patients' home, using more direct capture from patients. It's not about a specific protocol design per se. You have on the screen one example from the topic brief I just mentioned, and in one potentially fully decentralized clinical trial, you could see that visits in green, like the first dosing visit, could be a home visit. So a nurse will go to the patient home, potentially to draw labs, take vitals. The patients might go to a local facility to take an X-ray. You may use e-consent. The next visit one, you might do totally virtually using telehealth. You might need to use a home device to take the vital. Visit two, maybe the nurse will go there and take, again, blood sample again, and so on. So you can see when you fully decentralize, it's really about going to the patients and putting the patient at the center and not having the patients going to the site. And in that context, you're leveraging more telemedicine. Maybe you'll have unscheduled video safety visits, and you might use ESAs. So when you fully decentralize, it's really about reaching out to the patient directly. Next slide, Tristan. And it is, as I said, very interesting. Prior to COVID-19, the adoption of processes related to decentralized clinical trial was very limited. And you can see an expansion of the adoption of decentralized clinical trial processes and technologies. The last slide before Dimitris takes over is some feedback. So those have not been implemented by every company, but as you can see from the poll, so some of you have been at a larger scale implementing some of them. So some companies have been considering creating a business continuity plan for each trial. Many companies are starting to use more telehealth, stopping enrollment, and delaying study start. And per the poll, over 60% of you have done that already. Some companies are anticipating the end of COVID-19. or starting to create guidance to their study team on how to restart activities on halted studies post-COVID-19. And some companies have mandated COVID-19 related training. So in case of inspections, if you change your processes, you need to be inspection ready. And some companies are feeling that you need to have documented training on the processes you're changing during COVID-19 or any specific new potentially guidance coming out related to COVID-19. So now let's move into subject management, and up to you, Dimitris.
Thank you, Patrick. First, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone around the world. And a big thank you to SCDM for creating this platform to share our respective information. As we go through these, you'll notice that some are in higher level activities and some are very detailed activities. So I think what the team tried to do was relay back to everyone the information that was received and not digest it and modify it too much other than to aggregate it. In some cases, you may see some additional text in red where we received feedback from an organization that they were doing X or Y, but we thought it was prudent to then disclose that there might be a limitation based on a guidance or a regulation to make sure everyone is aware that those words are ours as opposed to the rest of it, which is the feedback from the organizations that took part. Just as Patrick showed, we have answers most companies gave versus answers that only some companies gave. In the most category for subject management, one of the feedbacks that we consistently received was not having created any special custom forms. And keep in mind, your methods of collection have to always align with your protocol. You cannot update one without the other. So yet another reason and driver to keep those things, the existing methods in use. In the case of discontinuations or exits from study, some companies call it end of study status, some call it disposition, some call it exit form. In the cases where the patient themselves was reporting a COVID-19 infection or a SARS-CoV-2 infection, the normal, which most organizations were already using, basically still continues to be in play, which is reporting the actual infection or potentially a positive test, which is the only actual way to confirm the infection, to report it as an AE or an SAE, depending on the grading. And use your regular process for capturing the discontinuation reason being an adverse event, and thereby relaying it back to the AE form, allowing you to properly then report and list that in your subsequent reporting. If, however, the patient was discontinued for reasons, environmental reasons related to COVID-19, transportation, the site itself perhaps not being able to see patients that were not COVID patients, most of the organizations replied back that there's a means of capturing an other reason for discontinuation besides the standard CDIS codes, in which case then the guidance was to specify that via verbatim as under the option of other, and making sure to mention COVID-19. Now, this is going to be actually interesting because I think in the many ways that this is driving changes in behavior in our industry, there's going to be some actual acceleration of some capabilities. And I think with the flurry of feedback on using comments, I can see a push for more advanced NLP processing and reporting in a lot of this as organizations try to make sense of all of it. Trafin, if you could go to the next slide, please. So continuing on the topic of subject management, then kind of the minority feedback that we received from some companies was, and this one was specific to companies that have Long-term follow-ups, which is common, I guess most common in oncology. Some gene therapy trials also tend to have these in this, where they're not actively collecting AEs any longer. So in the case where a patient discontinues, not because of the disease that's being studied, or in the unfortunate circumstance of a death, that you can no longer relate it back to an AE because you're not collecting the AEs. And in this particular context, most, again, using either a standard exit, disposition, and the study form, or some companies have specific notification of death forms. Some have them built into the disposition form. Again, using those means that they already had in place. Of course, in this context, having to use verbatims again, but not having the ability to reference back to an AE that would eventually be coded. So a slightly different, but somewhat consistent approach. All of these things, though, are things that definitely, as organizations are taking the steps to update their guidances to collect information in certain ways, making sure that they're staying aligned with their statistical programming group, to making sure that all of these can be reported out in proper context. If we go to the next slide, please, Trafi. Again, with subject management, we had a lot of these, where we had individual answers from some organizations. Although the first one was a little more common around the use of local labs for standard safety labs instead of central labs, if the subject could not travel to the pre-specified site or central laboratory. There's actually in the updated FDA guidance from just 2 days ago, 2 or 3, maybe 3 days ago, they've actually added some additional detail in scenarios where this happens for routine safety versus a critical endpoint. And I think their guidance for a critical endpoint, before you start blending those procedures at different locations, was to consult the agency. And then with, again, the next one regarding ECOA, one of the questions in the also in the updated FAQs from the FDA guidance addressed this. But we didn't have, literally that. I was just reading that yesterday, so it's not reflected here. But if something is replaced, being able to document, first of all, being very cautious in considering what you're replacing, if it's a routine item or if it's a critical endpoint item, especially in the latter scenario, making sure that your organization has some means of differentiating, making sure that you've properly documented it for a protocol amendment as appropriate. And if you've mixed modalities, which is something that all of us feel should be avoided if possible, sometimes it may not be, but if you are going to end up mixing modalities, being cautious to be able to differentiate which modality was used for which visit, for which patient, in what context, because depending on if it's your critical endpoint, that may then trigger a sensitivity analysis, and you can only do that if you can differentiate what was captured by which method. In the ePro scenarios, we saw some scenarios where companies were, and actually some of us were through the SCDM consortium, we're exchanging thoughts and ideas outside of the context of even this presentation to compare options that we were leveraging in these scenarios. So in some cases, there were procedures being completed at the ePro pages being completed at the site, but there wasn't a real reason for it to be completed at the site. It was just a matter of simplicity of having less devices based at the site. They weren't tethered to a procedure at the site. In those cases, companies explored and in some cases executed post-production changes to allow the patients to complete it from home. But in the scenario where that couldn't be done with a bring your own device scenario, like a downloadable app, the same challenges were faced, because in order to shift to that means now you have to ship supplies to patients' homes, which means you're going to deal with some of the same supply chain issues that are causing your Amazon orders to take 3 or 4 weeks instead of 2 days. And I think it's also important to note that you really can't take shortcuts in this. 21.11 and all the relevant regulations still apply. If you've decided to do it to convert a directly entered patient-reported outcome into an interview, that doesn't mean you give the site the patient's credentials to log in for them. It means you now have to work with your partner who is delivering your repros to create a new role in there for the site to be able to complete it via an interview process. And you will see, based on the feedback that we received, there's different capacities for some of these changes depending on the platform and depending on the vendor. Not everyone can make these changes mid-flight. Next slide, Trefine. So now on to the site management category. Again, going back to the common thread from the point that Patrick began is, in general, most companies elected to not make changes to their CRFs. I think we'll be having different discussions for future scenarios depending on how long this crisis stays with us. But in a robust design where you can capture AEs, you can capture missed visits and the reason for the missed visit, there really wasn't seen a reason to do this. In most cases, there were no changes to CRFs, but there were updates to CRF instructions, depending on what your organization calls them, data entry guidelines, data entry instructions, CRF instructions. Very consistently, organizations give us feedback that they either made the changes in their instructions or issued communications communicating the changes while they have time to make the changes to the online tools, meaning data entry guidelines that are built in as you're completing the system. The organizations that have varying degrees of source management guidelines also updated them to capture any changes in leveraging telehealth or remote patient visits. These were, I guess, the top three for sure were very common. The fourth was relatively common. Trefine, if we could move to the next slide, please. So again, continuing with the most category around site management feedback, most of the responders informed us that they stopped or significantly reduced on-site monitoring, and then had to undergo some process on the impact of doing so to their DB log process. And I think here was where companies that had more flexible approaches found a way to update that plan versus organizations that had the kind of old 100%, because 100% doesn't leave a whole lot of room for flexibility. And I think then you're in the context of either updating your plan or making a decision around your database log timing. Increase of remote and risk-based monitoring, definitely very consistent. And here's another potential silver lining in some of the areas where we may be accelerating some things that were already happening in our industry, but happening at adoption was at a slow pace. I think for sure this is accelerating the possibility of leveraging both remote monitoring and more consistently applying risk-based monitoring across all of our respective portfolios in the different companies, as opposed to just select ones. The concept of centralized data review, obviously this is nothing new. If you think about centralized data review, it's what DM has done since the beginning of the existence of something like DM. It's what clinical has always done in the context of safety data. But I think the volume and the frequency of this has definitely accelerated, because companies want to keep very close tabs on the status of their studies, the status of their sites and patients, and offer support to the sites as they need it if they're not able to get to certain activities. And then some companies are considering the source copy SDV approach, or remote access to medical records as opposed to leveraging a source copy. Now, this is something which you will see some variation. I would say, especially if you compare the FDA guidance and the EMA guidance, you will see some opening to the possibility on the EMA guidance, but at the same time, you have to also be aware that in different locations in Europe, there are very differing local restrictions to whether or not that is even possible. And in the guidance that EMA issued, it's still very tightly restricted as to when and how one should leverage the remote capability. And it even goes as far to say that if it was for critical information, which is kind of when they say the only scenario you should do it anyway, that you should go back afterwards and confirm under the assumption that what you were SDVing in contact, during the crisis was so anonymized that it may have been difficult for the CRA to confirm which patient source data that were truly SDVing or doing source data review, therefore then perpetuating the need to go back and verify that they were looking at the right patient the whole time when they were doing their SDV and SDR. So, kind of caution around the fact that many source documents have personal identifiers. This is not a straightforward process, and centrally it still has some impacts here, because the reason we have monitors in Portugal is because they speak Portuguese and they can read and write Portuguese. And if you start doing centralized monitoring and SDV, you need to be able to have the capacity to read those source documents. Obviously, that's common sense, but just something to raise because it was raised by the feedback and obviously observed. Must document any of these changes in your monitoring plan. Some companies have appendices or different related documents, but in general, the monitoring plan. Impacted and non-impacted sites. This is obviously it's somewhat operational, but at the same time, the sponsor being aware that is happening and monitoring it, addressing, supporting the site as needed. You'll hear a little more about IMP scenarios from Peter to follow, and then documenting PDs that are observed via monitoring appropriately with the correct flag, so that however you're summarizing your protocol deviations, you're able to differentiate between the ones that are COVID related or not COVID related, because that is something that is consistent in the guidance that we saw across regulators. Next slide, please, Trifine. Poll question number 2. As a result of COVID-19, did your clinical data management function, and select all that apply as answers, increase our risk-based approaches to focus on critical data, increase surveillance of known risks, change SDV settings in EDC, develop COVID-19 related checks, listings, and dashboards, or none of the above? And we'll give you a, let's say 1 minute to answer. I feel like there should be a Jeopardy chime in the background going. Halfway. Okay, I think that's about 1 minute, Trifine, if we can look at the results from the audience. Pretty expected. I'm a little surprised at the only 53% at the increase of risk-based approaches, but yeah, that's interesting and useful information. Thank you, everyone, for participating. Now, if we can go back to the overview, Trifine. And the last segment, data management, that I'll do before passing it on to Peter. Feedback from most companies on data handling. We've beat this horse. No changes to the CRM. But in the sense, though, of how to capture when something was missing or not done or due to COVID-19, we had pretty consistent response that most companies were leveraging the comments capabilities in the respective EDC systems. And as an industry, we're trying to move away from comments, but I think in this context, it proved a useful alternative across the board. And updating the respective instructions around the missed visits and procedures, the dispositions, and the interruption of treatments to make sure that it was captured with a particular reason of COVID-19 if it was modified. Next slide, Trifine. I'm not going to go through all of the green area here because that is quite, I can talk about it for too long. But around their data reviews, definitely we saw, that's why I said I was a little surprised at the 53% in the survey, because, and maybe it's how people interpret the meaning of risk-based approaches, but definitely we saw feedback that there was higher focus on delineating and focusing on the critical data, especially as it pertains to patient safety and clinical efficacy, of course. An increased frequency of data reviews across various roles on study teams, an increased data surveillance, like I said earlier, monitoring whether it was at the patient level or the site level, but an increased surveillance so that we could, in many cases, be able to follow up with sites and offer them support. Of course, that means where sites were actually able to take communications, and because they were busy doing other critical things. Less than 50% of the companies that participated actually said they would query for missing visits and missing critical procedures, which was an interesting point of feedback. And of course, usually DMP or DRP, depending on what your particular organization calls it. Some have both, but adding a section with these additional details in the context of COVID, or in some cases accompanying documents that are referenced to by the DRP or DMP. Again, pretty consistently, because in our business, it's not done unless it's documented that it was done. Next slide, please, Trifine. Some feedback, not as consistent as the others, was actually to add a specific code into the EDC to be selected in the case of not done to be COVID-19. This was much less common. And keeping in mind that for some companies those codes are kept as holy grail across every single study, and when you change those, you're impacting potentially many. Aligning SDV configuration and EDC with changes on site monitoring process. This is where some sponsors identify critical data that is required to be SDV in their EDC system, or a subset of data that is contained within the RBM process within the EDC system. And then providing guidance for handling studies and sites that are closed prematurely. I would imagine this is probably much more common, but was actually only specifically referenced in some feedback. But in case we did receive the feedback that in cases where it was happening, they issued specific guidance to help the organization manage those steps across, a global organization. You would imagine will want this done consistently, and assuring they're following local regulations as they're doing so. Next slide, please, Trifine. I think I'm going to kick off this question, and then when we come back, I'm going to hand it over to my good friend Peter Stockman. So, as a result of COVID-19, did your company A, change their AE reporting process, B, change their SAE reporting process, C, change their protocol deviation process, or D, none of the above? And Trifine, if you could put up the actual, there you go, thank you. Again, we'll give the audience 1 minute to complete. 10 more seconds. Okay, Trifine, thank you. If we go back and see what the results were from this part. Interesting. So few had changes to the reporting process, few had changes to the SCA reporting process. 52% had changes to their protocol deviation processes. Understandable. And 43% had changes to none of the above. Perhaps that piece is the most surprising one of all. Thank you all for sharing that information. And on that note, then, I think we'll go to the next slide and hand off to Peter Stockman.
Thank you very much, Dimitris. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Yeah, I'm not so surprised with that answer, because I also think in many guidance documents they kind of refer to use your standard process, and of course PD is different, but in many cases if you have a solid process it could also work under these circumstances. So clinical supplies, yeah, I have a couple of slides on clinical supplies, protocol deviations, and safety reporting. And with respect to clinical supplies, of course, in the context of preventing avoidable visits to the site and still provide the subjects with their medication, regulators give suggestions on, providing larger amounts to the subjects, making sure there's sufficient stock at the site, and delivery to trial participants via the site. And in the most recent version of the EMA guidance, they also refer to providing medication to the participants via an independent distributor, straight from the sponsor via a distributor. What most companies said with respect to investigational product, and I should stress that this is not only investigational product, but also non-IMPs, as well as in vitro diagnostics and medical devices. Most companies gave as feedback that they do allow sites to ship directly to the patient, but they review that on a case-to-case basis. And most companies also indicated that they created some guidance for IP shipment directly to the patients. And of course, they only are okay with that. They only authorize that approach when drug stability is sufficient for that purpose. And of course, if the subject is able to self-administer. And again, like in the normal situation, the site is expected to have a documented process for that. And all the other expectations, of course, remain the same with respect to temperature control, temperature logging, drug accountability, etc. And of course, sponsors have to track. They all indicated that they will be tracking IP discontinuation due to COVID in the ECRF in the exposure or exposure as collected form. And of course, when we are changing the process, the process of drug dispensing is in many cases managed by the IXRS system, so IVRS or IXRS web-based. When the process changes, of course, also that may have an impact on the IXRS system. So, for instance, if threshold levels at the site change, that has to be included in the system. If we go to the next slide, Trifine. Next slide is about protocol deviations. And again, I mean, in case of a lockdown or subjects staying away from the sites, there will be missing missing procedures, missing assessments. And although we saw in the poll that Patrick showed that 64% indeed is using remote ways to collect data, like phone or Skype or something like that, still this is an important reason for deviation. What most companies did was to give guidance to enter standard language for protocol deviations, of course referring to COVID, which would enable the biostatisticians to analyze based on recognizable and being able to attribute protocol deviations to COVID-19. What some companies did was add a new category or do some flagging in the protocol deviation management tool. And of course, as mentioned, it's all based. I mean, we can enable the statisticians to attribute any protocol deviations to COVID-19 if that text is added. And perhaps one more thing, at least in my company, we use central data review or central statistical monitoring, whatever you are used to calling it. And for us, protocol deviations is an indicator for site performance. And with what is happening now, it's very clear that PDs, but also many other of these indicators will be completely off the chart. So we'll have to compensate for in one way or the other to still see what is going on. Trifine, if you would like to move to the next slide, which is about safety reporting. Of course, the investigators are supposed and expected to continue safety reporting per protocol. But of course, when the visits cannot happen or are reduced or postponed, then again, we have to try to find other ways to follow up via Skype and phone. Most companies use the standard AE and SAE form, as we also seem to see in the poll that Dimitris showed. But as mentioned, indicate that subjects are infected by COVID-19 explicitly, but they do that in the standard AE SAE form. As you may know, on the 1st of April, in addition to the MSSO MEDRA was issued that proposed some COVID-specific proposed preferred terms. Some additional guidance to sites. Some companies, indeed, provided additional guidance to sites on capturing COVID-19 tests as well as COVID-specific signs and symptoms. Some companies noted that although it may not be 100% possible to diagnose all COVID cases, some AEs may remain in a more generically coded term. Although some medical safety physicians indicated, so from companies indicated, that they may choose to query the sites to confirm the diagnosis if the symptoms are suggestive of a COVID infection. If you go to the next slide, Trifine, you will see what was issued by MSSO MEDRA. So proposed preferred terms. Some of these were existent already. They were available. Some are proposed, particularly something like COVID-19 immunization, COVID-19 prophylaxis. This was issued, of course, to harmonize and standardize the approach of coding and reporting COVID-related events. And MEDRA indicated that next version 2.23.1 will be issued in September of this year. And also a new COVID-19 related standards MEDRA query is anticipated to be part of that update. So with that, I think I want to hand it back to Patrick again, who will focus on clinical study reports. Yes.
Yeah. No, thanks, Peter. Thanks, Dimitris. So we're almost reaching the end and getting close to the Q&A. So when it comes to the clinical study report, in some extent, it's the last piece in the process, and there would be an expectation by regulator on every company, most companies, will document the impact of COVID-19 in their CSR. So what the intent of the documentation will be? One, list all protocol deviations related to COVID-19. So it's not surprising that some companies have updated their protocol deviation process on or flagging COVID-19 related protocol deviations. So I think the idea is that we need to list all of the impacted patients by COVID-19. It could be directly impacted by the patient being infected by the disease or indirectly being impacted by being quarantined, not being able to conduct some procedures. And as mentioned by Peter, MSSO is going to increase support to COVID-19. In September, we have a SMQ, a special MEDRA query related to COVID-19, and you could potentially use that SMQ later in September to identify all COVID-19 impacted patients from your AE dataset. So that will be a good tool to leverage in future. So, and companies are planning to summarize COVID-19 impact on missing data in general, missed visits. As Dimitri mentioned prior, there will be changes to some of the processes and potentially modalities on how you collect ECOA, as an example. And if you're having different processes before, during, and after COVID-19, it would be wise to consider a sensitivity analysis and to assess the impact of those procedure changes to the integrity or the scientific integrity of your clinical study. Next slide, Tracy. Some of the companies, not all, are potentially excluding safety local lab values, from statistical analysis on TSR. So what they plan to do is, so if the lab is just for safety, they will authorize the patient to go to a local lab. If there is any finding in the local lab, it will be reported as an AE or potentially an SA. And they felt it wasn't necessary to include that lab value into the CSR on statistical analysis because it was covered as an AE already or any finding. And that was just a safety lab and not an efficacy or critical to the CSR. As I mentioned, some companies are considering, and I believe it's increasing, to summarize the AE profile before and after the pandemic. We expect that to be impacted. We know, for example, that some patients who have chronic diseases are not going to their physicians anymore. They are confined home. So you could see potentially on other diseases a decrease on AE reporting because patients are confined, but it would make sense to assess the impact of COVID-19 to your CSR on safety by under or over reporting. And finally, many companies or some companies are developing boilerplate CSR templates to guide the team on what to document and have consistency in their CSR across studies. So this concludes the slide. So we'll go to the last poll before we open to the Q&A. So this poll is moving forward, is really as a result of the changes implemented in response to COVID-19. Do you anticipate your company to, in future, scale up a decentralized clinical trial process and system, all or partially, adjust business continuity strategy moving forward, scale up risk-based clinical data management strategies, scale up centralized monitoring strategies, or none of the above? So we'll give you 1 minute. And the early feedback we have been getting actually is many of the companies are going to continue with some of the COVID-19 related process changes moving forward. So it's not going to stop now. It took a while for companies to adopt some of those new technologies and processes, and many companies are seeing potentially values beyond COVID-19. So it would be interesting to see in your organization what people are feeling. So 20 seconds, and we'll pull the results out. So Trifine, let's get the outcome of the poll. So 45%, 67%, 70%. And that's totally consistent actually about the feedback we are getting. Even if it's easy to say, but many people think there will be a post-COVID-19 thanks to Triffin, and maybe we'll start moving gradually to the Q&A. And many companies are seeing that post-COVID-19, a lot of the process changes being adopted had value beyond the COVID-19 crisis. So I don't know. So I will invite all of you to start putting questions in the chat box, and we'll be taking questions shortly. Few comments on, like Dimitri's, what on the poll number 2. I was a tiny bit surprised to see that only that 24% of the organization had their data management not doing anything to address COVID-19 potentially. So anything, not scaling up risk-based monitoring, increasing surveillance, or changing SDV, or adding checklisting on dashboard. I think our mission today as SCDM leadership is to urge clinical data management to take action. We believe that in a world where we're going to be closer to patients, implement more direct to patients data capture system, CDM will have to take an increasing role. We are pushing, and we know we're going to all evolve to more clinical data science, have more central role in clinical development. I think it would be good for all of us to take up the challenge and really play a bigger role in clinical development in general. So, Triffin, do we have the first few questions?
Yes, I can see that we've received a question from Maker. She said, how are COVID-19 tests and the results handled? Some might not be done to clarify an AE, but to ensure and show that the participant is not infected when he continues the trial. Are there any special ECRF pages existing for that?
John?
I can chime in here, Patrick, and obviously,
yeah.
Well, like I said, based on the feedback, and I can also speak personally, no specific pages were created to capture this information. Standard existing AE pages. In some cases, companies had kind of very generic lab forms where the actual analyte could be defined within the form and the result. And in those cases, they may be doing it ad hocly. But in general, the AE in of itself would be reported, and a positive test in of itself would be reported within the normal existing AE context. Patrick, I don't know, or Peter, if you want to answer.
No, it will be the exact same on my side. And the feedback, you're right, it's suggesting companies are not changing their reporting process, and they would only report a positive test on confirmed infections. And they would not create a specific ECRF to capture a negative test. It's consistent with the feedback on what we're doing as well in my organization. Exact same.
Okay, great. We've also received another question. Why are companies excluding local lab data?
Okay, so and what I tried to explain so in the context of COVID-19, so assuming you're using a central lab for a safety reason, just for overall safety, right? And because of COVID-19, patients cannot go to the site and they cannot get their blood sample being drawn. So as a result, if you just want to continue that safety oversight, you might authorize the patients to go to a local lab. And the local lab will give you a printout, and the local lab will not be able to give you data transfer with all of that data. So you have two options. Either you take that piece of paper and you create a form in your ECRF to enter the local lab value. Some organizations are saying that that local lab is just for safety. It is not for efficacy. I'm not expecting specific safety concern on my study. If there is any signal or finding from that local lab, That local lab will be kept as a source by the site. The site will report an adverse event related to that local lab on the fact that these safety issues was reported already as an AE or an SAE. They do not see humongous value on re-entering the local lab value in their ECIF, knowing that they could document the process change in their data management plan and document in their CSR, and they would expect the AE on SE, no matter what, to be reported. So they would not under-report AE or SAEs. They would just not have the corresponding lab values. That's the feedback from. But that's not done across companies. It was one or two companies mentioning that.
I would also add that if you look at, there's been a small trend, but a trend, companies are starting to reconsider whether or not it's really necessary to collect. It doesn't mean they're not done, but to collect all the wholesale, every visit, safety lab data, as opposed to only critical analytes that matter for that particular study, especially when this drug is well understood. And not obviously you wouldn't do that in early stages of the drug's development life, but there was already a kind of trend to do so. On the other hand, companies today, depending on how flexible their model is, if it's a central lab study, they may or may not have an ad hoc local lab capability within the same study. So it's important to delineate where some decisions may have to be made by some companies based on what they have at their disposal, their arsenal, and to make a quick decision, versus what they may have done proactively had they had a year to plan for the crisis. So.
Yeah, and maybe lastly, if you go back to this first slide with a summary from the regulations, the number one focus is patient safety. So no company would put patient safety at risk. We're only going to have more risk-based approaches if this is just a lab value for safety. It will be reported as an AE, and some of those analytes may be more critical than others. So, but to be clear, none of the company is suggesting we would lower the safety bar. It's just saying when you're moving to a more risk-based approach, we have to ensure patient safety. And in the case of a routine safety local lab, that value does not add extra benefit, knowing that we already reported the AE and the SAE. But again, no risk to the patient safety ever. So that's the number one principle, is just a risk-based process change. And we have a few more, 10 more minutes. Do you have a few more questions on?
Yeah, we do. We've got quite a few questions actually. So the next question is there any plan or any recommendation to look at the WHO and CDC person under investigation, CRFs, to determine if there are base fields that we could ensure are used and collected within the current studies?
Okay. I'm not sure I get the last part. Could you repeat?
Yeah, sure. I'll just repeat the question again. Is there any plan or any recommendation to look at the WHO and CDC person under investigation, CRFs, to determine if there are base fields that we should ensure are used and collected within the current studies?
Sure. I'm not sure I fully comprehended about the other panelists the question in context. I mean, the WHO has issued kind of guidance on how to diagnose the disease and other various guidances, but I'm not sure that they're specific to what to collect in the clinical trial. I'm not sure.
And what we said is overall, most companies have not changed their ECIF. They would report positive infections. Any safety will be reported the standard way. And I don't believe the ECIF is meant to collect study-specific information in general anyway. So it is unlikely that we would update.
Yeah, I could see for studying COVID, where some of that information would be pertinent in designing new standards to use in studying COVID. But as a general non-COVID related studies, I don't believe so.
And if I'm correct, I believe CDs did provide standard forms to consider in the context of COVID-19 studies as well. And maybe you may want to look at that. So you may want to look at CDs because they should have considered it, and they have COVID-19 specific forms to consider for your COVID-19 study. So maybe that could be one way you could investigate that. But overall, I agree with you, Dimitri, unless it's a COVID-19, we would not update the ECI.
Okay, great. And we've also received a comment from Sanjay. He's just said, this is one of the best webinars I've ever attended from SCDM, real thought leadership on display, kudos. So just thought I'd put that there as well.
Cool. Thank you.
And the next question is, are companies conducting COVID-19 trials seeing similar challenges?
Oh, yeah. I don't believe anything we just said would not apply to COVID-19. I think if you do COVID-19, it would be even more complex and you have extra. So in that case, you will have to potentially document negative tests, right, for a COVID-19 study. So, but I don't think any of the recommendations you are making, for the most part, would not apply. Because even if you're on a COVID-19 study, you still have the same limitations as a regular study we are facing today.
Yeah, I could see where, you know, entry specific forms for entry criteria. Obviously, if someone has to be positive for COVID-19, it would be a little, of course, a very specific case. But otherwise, I would say no. I do think, though, everybody involved across the industry working on COVID, where we do see some incredible accomplishments across multiple organizations, is the speed through which the industry is moving in studying the disease and studying possible therapies and vaccines. And I think that's something that the whole industry should be commended for.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. So the next question we have is, you mentioned using free text fields to collect AE and PD relationship to COVID-19. If available, should companies use radio buttons and check boxes to capture this data?
I want to clarify specifically, we didn't say to use for AEs, we said to use existing standard AE process, which is, as far as I know, in any company, to collect the verbatim from the site and then to code that to a standard dictionary, right? So we weren't suggesting to create a new comment field for AEs at all. I hope that's clear.
Yeah. Exactly. And I think it was mentioned to free text to collect relationship, and I believe many companies on your AE page, when you report the verbatim, you would have a question about either is that AE require a treatment? Did the patient discontinue due to that AE? So I think you already have a code list on flag in your traditional AE form to document the outcome of that AE on the requirement for extra treatment, for extra post-failure, for if it leads to hospitalization, it becomes an SAE. So now if you're not suggesting using any text field for AEs and SAEs, you're suggesting potentially in some cases for missed visits, maybe you could put a form comment or item level comment that item is missing because of COVID-19. And you could potentially pull a report out of your EDC system with all the comments mentioning COVID-19. But we would likely not recommend at all using a free text to manage your safety or to change your AE process. No, thanks for asking.
As far as reasons for anything being radio buttons instead of comments, I mean that's a judgment call to the organization how they want to design their forms, if it's a drop down or a radio button, what have you. But just please keep in mind that if you choose radio buttons, that means that in every single form, a reason not done being COVID would now appear as a radio button. It just doesn't seem like a prudent use of your designs.
Yeah, yes, and to your point, and if you have a study ongoing during COVID-19, a long-term safety, let's say, and it's looking not until 2022, you might not want to carry a code list for the next 2 to 3 years that would only apply for like a 6-month period. So I think you have to be mindful of when you need to add a code list as opposed to just using the existing functionalities of your EDC system.
Okay.
Good question,
So
though.
the
No, thank you.
so the next question is, for any normal clinical trial in protocol for inclusion or exclusion criteria, will COVID-19 be included?
I don't think there could be a generic answer to that. I think that has to be a per case organizational decision, indication of study decision. You might consider whether the risk group that the indication is in, and a lot of other factors. And there may be local requirements anyway, so which have to always take precedent. But I don't think we can say it should or shouldn't. I think each organization has to consider the scenario. But I don't know, Peter, Patrick.
No, I agree. And a lot of the protocol changes, including changes to inclusion exclusion, are protocol specific and are company specific. You're right. It depends on the disease being studied. So I think it's every company's decision. And I don't believe there's any guidance from regulator mandating the addition of an exclusion criteria for patients being infected by COVID-19. So,
Right.
yeah.
Okay, so the next question we have is, do we expect more decentralized and e-source trials?
Definitely, I think, as you can
Yeah.
definitely. And to be honest with you, and if you, I'm trying to look at my my notes here. Yeah. So the last slide is poll 4. Okay, yeah. When you see the poll from the last poll for about scale up of decentralized processes, you already responded 45%. You are foreseeing an increase of decentralized clinical trial system and procedures. 67 said increase on business continuity plan, different business continuity plan. 73 on scale up of risk-based approaches. It is pretty clear on, hopefully that will be the topic of the panel of the last webinar about what will be the future post-COVID-19, but 100% we all believe that we will see a scale up of decentralized clinical trial, e-source, direct to patients. And it took a while for companies to move there, but now that we have been forced to move there, it would not probably make sense to go back because it's so much better for patient and site anyway. So, I don't know if you want to add anything, Dimitris.
No, absolutely agree. I think this is going to be a catalyst. There already has been a catalyst for specific procedures. I mean, you can't rewrite the entire protocol, but you can certainly leverage certain procedures like home health visits. Assuming you've adjusted for it in your protocol, to be clear. but this is definitely proving to be a catalyst, and I look forward to the next webinar discussion around the silver lining in all of this. Yeah.
So I think we're reaching the end of that webinar. So what I would say is we did not address all the questions, but we will be collecting all the questions you have been posting, and we will make sure to look at them and plan answer for the next webinar. So we use the poll answers from today. We use all the questions we got from the first webinar on regulation, the second webinar on the actions from industry, and we'll basically frame the last webinar around your questions and your feedback. So I want to thank you all for attending that webinar today. We are very excited to partner with you, and we hope you found this webinar informative. So thank you all. Thanks to the presenters. Thanks for SCDM.
Thank you all.
I just also wanted to say thank you, Patrick, Dimitris, and Peter, for a very informative presentation. Like you said, if there are any other questions or any questions that weren't answered, feel free to email us at learning@scdm.org. We can share this with the presenters as well. Other than that, I would like to just wish you all a good rest of your day.
Thank you very much. Be safe and healthy. Take care.
Yep.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Goodbye, everyone.
Take care. Bye.